Section 37 of Through Fairy Halls of My Book House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Through Fairy Halls of My Book House, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. The Ogre That Played Jackstraws, by David Starr Jordan. Once there was a terrible giant ogre, and he lived in a huge castle that was built right in the middle of a valley. All men had to pass by it when they came to the king's palace on the rock at the head of the valley, and they were all terribly afraid of the ogre and ran just as fast as they could when they went by. And when they looked back as they were running, they could see the ogre sitting on the wall of his castle, and he scowled at them so fiercely that they ran as fast as ever they could. For the ogre had a head as large as a barrel, and great black eyes sunk deep under long, bushy eyelashes. And when he opened his mouth, they saw that it was full of teeth, and so they ran away faster than ever, without caring to see anything more. And the king wanted to get rid of the ogre, and he sent his men to drive the ogre away and to tear down his castle. But the ogre scowled at them so savagely that their teeth began to fall out. And they all turned back and said they dare not fight such a horrid creature. Then Roger, the king's son, rode his black horse Hurricane up against the door of the ogre's castle and struck hard against the door with his iron glove. Then the door opened, and the ogre came out and seized Roger in one hand and the great black horse in the other, and rubbed their heads together. And while he did this, he made them very small. Then he tumbled them over the wall into the ogre's garden, and they crawled through a hole in the garden fence, and both ran home, Roger one way and Hurricane the other, and neither dared tell the king nor anyone else where he had been, nor what the ogre had done to him. But it was 2 or 3 days before they became large again. Then the king sent out some men with a cannon to batter down the walls of the ogre's castle. But the ogre sat on the wall and caught the cannonballs in his hand, and tossed them back at the cannon so that they broke the wheels and scared away all the men. And when the cannon sounded, the ogre roared so loudly that all the windows in the king's palace were broken, and the queen and all the princesses went down into the cellar and hid among the sugar barrels and stuffed cotton in their ears till the noise should stop. And whatever the king's men tried to do, the ogre made it worse and worse. And at last no one dared to go out into the valley beside the ogre's castle, and no one dared look at it from anywhere, because when the ogre scowled, all who saw him dropped to the ground with fear, and their teeth began to fall out. And when the ogre roared, there was no one who could bear to hear it. So the king and all his men hid in the cellar of the castle with the queen and the princesses, and they stuffed their ears full of cotton, and the ogre scowled and roared and had his own way. But there was one little boy named Pennyroyal who tended the black horse Hurricane, and he was not afraid of anything, because he was a little boy. And the little boy said he would go out and see the ogre and tell him to go away. And they were all so scared that they could not ask him not to go. So Pennyroyal put on his hat, filled his pockets with marbles, and took his kite under his arm, and went down the valley to the castle of the ogre. The ogre sat on the wall and looked at him, but the little boy was not afraid. And so it did the ogre no good to scowl. Then Pennyroyal knocked on the ogre's door, and the ogre opened it and looked at the little boy. "Please, Mr. Ogre, may I come in?" said Pennyroyal. And the ogre opened the door, and the little boy began to walk around the castle looking at all the things. There was one room filled with bones, but the ogre was ashamed of it, and did not want to let the little boy see it. So when Pennyroyal was not looking, the ogre just changed the room and made it small, so that instead of a room full of bones, it became just a box of jackstraws. And the big elephant he had there to play with he made into a lap elephant, and the little boy took it in his hand and stroked its tiny tusks and tied a knot in its trunk. And everything that could frighten the little boy the ogre made small and pretty, so that they had great times together. And by the ogre grew smaller and smaller, and took off his ugly old face with the long teeth and bushy eyebrows, and dropped them on the floor and covered them with a wolfskin. Then he sat down on the wolfskin, and the little boy sat down on the floor beside him, and they began to play jackstraws with the box of jackstraws that had been a room full of bones. The ogre had never been a boy himself, so jackstraws was the only game he knew how to play. Then the elephant he had made small snuggled down between them on the floor, and as they played with each other, the castle itself grew small and shrank away until there was just room enough for them and for their game. Up in the palace, when the ogre stopped roaring, the king's men looked out and saw that the ogre's castle was gone. Then Roger, the king's son, called for Pennyroyal, but when he could not find the boy, he saddled the black horse Hurricane himself and rode down the valley to where the ogre's castle had been. When he came back, he told the king that the ogre and his castle were all gone. Where the castle stood, there was nothing left but a board tent under the oak tree, and in the tent there were just two little boys playing jackstraws, and between them on the ground lay a candy elephant. That was all, for the terrible ogre was one of that kind of ogres that will do to folks just what folks do to them. There isn't any other kind of ogre. End of section 37. Recording by Jeff Machado.